Good day, class. This is Mr. J. de los Santos, the faculty in charge of History 104. Today, I will deliver a lecture on ancient America, or the America before the European invasion. Now in this lecture, it is expected from you that you will be able to find answer to the following questions. Who were the first Americans? Why were humans able to migrate into North America after? What civilizations existed in America before the arrival of Europeans? Before the lecture begins, ready yourself, your mind and attention. Your pen and paper for note-taking. Okay? Then let's get started. The first human beings to arrive in the Western Hemisphere emigrated from Asia. They brought with them hunting skills, weapon and tool-making techniques, and a full range of other forms of human knowledge developed millennia earlier in Africa, Europe, and Asia. These first Americans hunted large mammals, such as the mammoths they had learned in Europe and Asia to kill, butcher, and process for food, clothing, building materials, and many other purposes. Most likely, these first Americans wandered into the Western Hemisphere more or less accidentally, hungry and in pursuit of their prey. But the question is, how were humans able to migrate into North America? Accordingly, two major developments made it possible for human beings to migrate to the Western Hemisphere. First, humans successfully adapted to the frigid environment near the Arctic Circle. Second, changes in the Earth's climate reconnected North America to Asia. By about 25,000 BP before present, Homo sapiens had spread from Africa throughout Europe and Asia. People, probably women, had learned to use bone needles to sew animal skins into warm clothing that permitted them to become permanent residents of extremely cold regions such as northeastern Siberia. During the last global cold spell, which endured from about 25,000 BP to 14,000 BP, snow piled up in glaciers, causing the sea level to drop as much as 350 feet below its current level. The falling sea level exposed what experts refer to as a land bridge between Asian Siberia and American Alaska. This land bridge, which scientists call Beringia, opened a pathway hundreds of miles wide between the eastern and western hemispheres. The Beringia connect eastern and western hemisphere, Asia and America, allowing humans to migrate. Siberian hunters presumably roamed Beringia for centuries in search of game animals. Grasses and small shrubs that covered Beringia supported herds of mammoths, bison, and numerous smaller animals. As the hunters ventured farther and farther east, they eventually became pioneers of human life in the Western Hemisphere. Archaeologists refer to these first migrants and their descendants for the next few millennia as Paleo-Indians. The first migrants probably arrived sometime after 15,000 BP before present. They speculate that these Siberian hunters traveled in small bands of no more than 25 people. How many such bands arrived in North America before Beringia disappeared beneath the sea will never be known. Scattered and inconclusive evidence suggests that they may have arrived several thousand years earlier. Certainly, humans who originated in Asia inhabited the Western Hemisphere by 13,500 BP. Now, history students, look at this map. Here, you can see the patterns of migration. So when humans first arrived in the Western Hemisphere, massive glaciers covered most of present-day Canada. A narrow corridor not entirely obstructed by ice ran along the eastern side of Canada's Rocky Mountains, and most archaeologists believe that Paleo-Indians probably migrated through the ice-free passageway in pursuit of game. Aside from that idea, look at the map again. They may also have traveled along the Pacific and Atlantic coast in small boats, hunting marine life and hopscotching from one desirable landing spot to another. At the southern edge of the glaciers, Paleo-Indians entered a hunter's paradise. North, Central, and South America teemed with wildlife that had never before confronted wily two-legged predators armed with razor-sharp spears. Ample food permitted the Paleo-Indian population to grow. Within 1,000 years or so, Paleo-Indians had migrated to the tip of South America and virtually everywhere else in the Western Hemisphere, as proved by discoveries of their spear points in numerous excavations. Early Paleo-Indians used a distinctively shaped spearhead known as a Clovis point, named for the place in New Mexico where it was first excavated. Archaeologists' discovery of Clovis points throughout North and Central America in sites occupied between 13,500 BP and 13,000 BP provides evidence that these nomadic hunters shared a common ancestry and way of life. Paleo-Indians hunted mammoths and bison, judging from the artifacts and bones that have survived from this era, but they probably also hunted smaller animals. Concentration on large animals, when possible, made sense because just one mammoth kill supplied hunters with meat for weeks or, if dried, for months. In addition to food, mammoth kills provided hides and bones for clothing, shelter, tools, and much more. I hope you are still listening. Now let's continue. About 11,000 BP, Paleo-Indians confronted a major crisis. The mammoths and other large mammals they hunted became extinct. The extinction was gradual, stretching over several hundred years. Scientists are not completely certain why it occurred, although environmental change probably contributed to it. About this time, the Earth's climate warmed, glaciers melted, and sea levels rose. Mammoths and other large mammals probably had difficulty adapting to the warmer climate. Many archaeologists also believe, however, that Paleo-Indians probably contributed to the extinctions in the Western Hemisphere by killing large animals more rapidly than they could reproduce. Although this overkill hypothesis is disputed by some experts, similar environmental changes had occurred for millions of years without triggering the large mammal extinctions that followed the arrival of Paleo-Indian hunters. Whatever the causes, Paleo-Indian hunters faced a radical change in the natural environment within just a few thousand years of their arrival in the Western Hemisphere, namely, the extinction of large mammals. After the extinction, Paleo-Indians literally inhabited a new world. Paleo-Indians adapted to the drastic environmental change of the big game extinction by making at least two important changes in their way of life. First, hunters began to prey more intensively on smaller animals. Second, Paleo-Indians devoted more energy to foraging, that is, to collecting wild plant foods such as roots, seeds, nuts, berries, and fruits. When Paleo-Indians made these changes, they replaced the apparent uniformity of the big game-oriented Clovis culture with great cultural diversity adapted to the many natural environments throughout the hemisphere, ranging from icy tundra to steamy jungles. These post-Clovis adaptations to local environments resulted in the astounding variety of Native American cultures that existed when Europeans arrived in AD 1492. By then, more than 300 major tribes and hundreds of lesser groups inhabited North America alone. Okay. At this juncture, let's now discuss who are these Native Americans. First, we have the Southwest. The dry Southwest, what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah, hosted corn-growing societies, elements of which exist today and heirs to which, the Hopi, Zunis, and others, still live in the multi-story adobe, sun-baked mud, cliff-side villages called pueblos by the Spanish, erected by their ancient ancestors. Hohokam. The native Hohokam, those who have vanished people migrated from Mexico northward to southern and central Arizona, where they built hundreds of miles of irrigation canals to water crops. They also crafted decorative pottery and turquoise jewelry, and constructed temple mounds, earthen pyramids used for sacred ceremonies. Perhaps because of prolonged drought, the Hohokam society disappeared during the 15th century. Anasazi. The most widespread and best known of the Southwest Pueblo cultures were the Anasazi, ancient ones. They developed extensive settlements in the Four Corners region where the modern-day states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. Anasazi society was remarkable for not having a rigid class structure. The religious leaders and warriors worked much as the rest of the people did. The Anasazi engaged in warfare only as a means of self-defense. Environmental factors shaped Anasazi culture and eventually caused its decline. Toward the end of the 13th century, a lengthy drought and the aggressiveness of Indian peoples migrating from the north led to the disappearance of Anasazi society. Next, we have the Northwest. Along the narrow coastal strip running up the heavily forested Northwest Pacific coast, from northern California to Alaska, where shellfish, salmon, seals, whales, deer, and edible wild plants were abundant, there was little need for farming. In fact, many of the Pacific Northwest peoples, such as the Haida, Kwakiutl, and Nootka, needed to work only 2 days to provide enough food for a week. Because of plentiful food and thriving trade networks, the Native American population was larger and more concentrated than in other regions. Such social density enabled the Pacific Coast peoples to develop intricate religious rituals and sophisticated woodworking skills. They carved towering totem poles featuring decorative figures of animals and other symbolic characters. For shelter, they built large, earthen-floored, cedar plank houses up to 100 feet long, where whole groups of families lived together. They also created sturdy, ocean-going canoes carved out of red cedar tree trunks, some large enough to carry 50 people. Socially, the Indian bands along the northwest Pacific coast were divided into slaves, commoners, and chiefs. Warfare usually occurred as a means to acquire slaves. We also have the Great Plains. The many different peoples living on the Great Plains, Plains Indians, a vast, flat land of cold winters and hot summers west of the Mississippi River, and in the Great Basin, present-day Utah and Nevada, included the Arapaho, Blackfeet, Cheyenne, Comanche, Crow, Apache, and Sioux. As nomadic hunter-gatherers, they tracked enormous herds of bison across a sea of grassland, collecting seeds, nuts, roots, and berries as they roamed. At the center of most hunter-gatherer religions is the animistic idea that the hunted animal is a willing sacrifice provided by the gods, spirits. To ensure a successful hunt, these nomadic peoples performed sacred rites of gratitude beforehand. Once a buffalo herd was spotted, the hunters would set fires to drive the stampeding animals over cliffs. Next would be the Mississippians. East of the Great Plains, in the vast woodlands from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean, several mound-building cultures flourished as predominantly agricultural societies. The Adena and later the Hopewell peoples, both names derive from the archaeological sites in Ohio, developed communities along rivers in the Ohio Valley. The Adena-Hopewell cultures focused on agriculture, growing corn, squash, beans, and sunflowers, as well as tobacco for smoking. They left behind enormous earthworks and 200 elaborate burial mounds shaped like great snakes, birds, and other animals, several of which were nearly a quarter-mile long. Artifacts buried in the mounds have revealed a complex social structure featuring a specialized division of labor, whereby different groups performed different tasks for the benefit of the society as a whole. Some were fisher folk, others were farmers, hunters, artists, cooks, and mothers. Like the Adena, the Hopewell also developed an extensive trading network from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, exchanging exquisite carvings, metalwork, pearls, seashells, copper ornaments, and jewelry. By the 6th century, however, the Hopewell culture disappeared, giving way to a new phase of Native American development east of the Mississippi River, the Mississippian culture, which flourished from 800 to 1500. The Mississippians, centered in the southern Mississippi Valley, were also mound-building and corn-growing peoples led by chieftains. They grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers, and they built substantial towns around central plazas and temples. The Mississippian peoples, the most powerful of which were the Natchez, developed a far-flung trading network that extended to the Rocky Mountains. Their ability to grow large amounts of corn each year in the fertile flood plains of rivers spurred rapid population growth around regional centers. The largest of these advanced regional centers, called chiefdoms, was Cahokia 1050 to 1250, in southwest Illinois, just a few miles across the Mississippi River from what is now St. Louis, Missouri. There the Mississippians constructed an intricately planned farming settlement with monumental public buildings, spacious ceremonial plazas, and more than 100 flat-topped earthen pyramids with thatch-roofed temples on top. Over the years, the Cahokians cut whole forests to create their huge village and to protect it with a 2-mile-long stockade built of 15,000 oak and hickory logs 21 feet tall. At the height of its influence, prosperous Cahokia hosted 15,000 people on some 3,200 acres, making it the largest city north of Mexico. Outlying towns and farming settlements ranged up to 50 miles in all directions. Cahokia, however, vanished after 1250 and its people dispersed. What caused its collapse remains a mystery, but environmental changes are the most likely reason. The overcutting of trees may have set in motion ecological changes that doomed the community when a massive earthquake struck around 1200. The loss of trees led to widespread flooding and the erosion of topsoil that finally forced people to seek better lands. And lastly, we have the Eastern Woodlands peoples. After the collapse of Cahokia, the Eastern Woodlands peoples rose to dominance along the Atlantic seaboard from Maine to Florida and along the Gulf Coast to Louisiana. They included three regional groups distinguished by their different languages: the Algonquian, the Iroquoian, and the Muskogean. These were the societies the Europeans would first encounter when they arrived in North America. The Algonquians. The Algonquian-speaking peoples stretched from the New England seaboard to lands along the Great Lakes and into the upper Midwest and south to New Jersey, Virginia, and the Carolinas. The Algonquians along the Atlantic coast were skilled at fishing and gathering shellfish. The inland Algonquians excelled at hunting deer, moose, elk, bears, bobcats, and mountain lions. They often traveled the region's waterways using canoes made of hollowed-out tree trunks, dugouts, or birch bark. All of the Algonquians foraged for wild food, nuts, berries, and fruits, and practiced agriculture to some extent, regularly burning dense forests to improve soil fertility and provide grazing room for deer. To prepare their vegetable gardens, women broke up the ground with hoes tipped with clam shells or the shoulder blades from deer. In the spring, they planted corn, beans, and squash in mounds. As the corn stalks rose, the tendrils from the climbing bean plants wrapped around them for support. Once the crops ripened, women made a nutritious mixed meal of succotash, combining corn, beans, and squash. They constructed no great mounds or temple-topped pyramids. Most Algonquians lived in small, round shelters called wigwams or multifamily longhouses. Their villages typically ranged in size from 500 to 2,000 people, but they often moved their villages with the seasons. The Iroquoians. West and south of the Algonquians were the powerful Iroquoian-speaking peoples including the Seneca, Onondaga, Mohawk, Oneida, and Cayuga nations, as well as the Cherokee and Tuscarora, whose lands spread from upstate New York southward through Pennsylvania and into the upland regions of the Carolinas and Georgia. The Iroquois were farmer and hunters who lived together in extended family groups, clans, sharing bark-covered longhouses in towns of 3,000 or more people. The oldest woman in each longhouse was deemed the clan mother of the residents. Villages were surrounded by palisades, tall fences made of trees intended to fend off attackers. Their most important crops were corn and squash, both of which figure prominently in Iroquois mythology. Unlike the Algonquian culture, in which men were dominant, women held the key leadership roles in the Iroquoian culture. As an Iroquois elder explained, in our society, women are the center of all things. Nature, we believe, has given women the ability to create, therefore it is only natural that women be in positions of power to protect this function. Men and women were not treated as equals. Rather, the two genders operated in two separate social domains. No woman could be a chief, no man could head a clan. Women selected the chiefs, controlled the distribution of property, and planted and harvested the crops. After marriage, the man moved in with the wife's family. In part, the Iroquoian matriarchy reflected the frequent absence of Iroquois men, who as skilled hunters and traders traveled extensively for long periods, requiring women to take charge of domestic life. War between rival groups of Native Americans, especially the Algonquians and Iroquois, was commonplace, usually as a means of settling feuds or gaining slaves. Success in fighting was a warrior's highest honor. As a Cherokee explained in the 18th century, we cannot live without war. Should we make peace with the Tuscaroras, we must immediately look out for some other nation with whom we can engage in our beloved occupation. The Muskogean. The third major Native American group in the eastern woodlands included the southern peoples along the Gulf Coast who spoke the Muskogean language, the Creeks, Chickasaws, and Choctaws. Like the Iroquois, they were often matrilineal societies, meaning that ancestry was traced only through the mother's line, but they had a more rigid class structure. The Muskogeans lived in towns arranged around a central plaza. In the region along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, many of their thatch-roofed houses had no walls because of the hot, humid summers. Over thousands of years, the native North Americans had displayed remarkable resilience, adapting to the uncertainties of frequent warfare, changing climate, and varying environments. They would display similar resilience in the face of the challenges created by the arrival of Europeans. Concluding note. The world of the ancient America. Ancient Americans shaped the history of human beings in the New World for more than 12,000 years. They established continuous human habitation in the Western Hemisphere from the time the first big game hunters crossed Beringia until 1492 and beyond. Much of their history remains irretrievably lost because they relied on oral rather than written communication. But much can be pieced together from artifacts they left behind. Ancient Americans achieved their success through resourceful adaptation to the hemisphere's many and ever-changing natural environments. They also adapted to social and cultural changes caused by human beings, such as marriages, deaths, political struggles, and warfare, but the sparse evidence that has survived renders those adaptations almost entirely unknowable. Their creativity and artistry are unmistakably documented in the artifacts they left at kill sites, camps, and burial mounds. Those artifacts sketch the only likenesses of ancient Americans we will ever have, blurred, shadowy images that are indisputably human but forever silent. In the 5 centuries after 1492, just 4% of the time human beings have inhabited the Western Hemisphere. Europeans and their descendants began to shape and eventually to dominate American history. Native American peoples continued to influence major developments of American history for centuries after 1492. But the new wave of strangers that at first trickled and then flooded into the New World from Europe and Africa forever transformed the peoples and places of ancient America. Thanks for listening.